Before we finally leave our layouting and design chapter, there is one more important thing that we have to take a look at. Now, I don't know if you noticed so far, but we touched a lot of properties in the inspector here, a lot of Flexbox properties. But one thing that we never had to do is to actually tell elements where they are. We never had to set something like a position, like this element is, I don't know, at X position 200 and Y position 300 or whatever. Now, this was all done kind of by Flexbox magic for us. And Flexbox is very powerful, and it's actually one of the big advantages of Flexbox that you very rarely have to do this. And it basically does all this stuff for you just by setting those things like flex direction, the align properties, the base, the grow, and the shrink. It's able to, in, I don't know, 8 of 10 cases, figure out what you need with your layout for you, basically. And that's why we never had to do that. But there are obviously some cases where you need to sort of override things from Flexbox, or where you need to say, okay, but it's okay, Flexbox, you figured out that this element should be in this position, but I actually want it to be somewhere else. And that's what we are going to look at now. So to be a bit more precise, a bit more specific, some examples when this is actually useful is, let's imagine that you need something like a pop-up window over your other elements. Now, Flexbox will not allow you to do this because Flexbox is sort of reducing all that you have on this 2D layer, and it kind of assumes that everything has its space on this 2D layer, and it does not have a concept of some other layer kind of lying above all of this stuff. So you cannot do this. Also, when you have things like, I don't know, you want to drag objects over other objects, this is also not possible in Flexbox, because the moment where you kind of change the position, you would interfere with the other objects as soon as they are in the Flexbox system. But UI Toolkit does allow you to sort of say, for certain elements that you don't want this behavior, to say, okay, wait a minute, you are not driven by Flexbox anymore. I am kind of throwing you out of this Flexbox system. And then we can basically do with these elements whatever we want and stack them on top of each other and stuff like that. And the way that works is, now we have this, again, very simple setup here, where we have a container and 3 items that are just squares. They have nothing fancy on them, just a little bit of color and some tiny margins so that we can distinguish them. And now they are all in the Flexbox system. You can see that the container has a column, normal column orientation, and that's why those elements are stuck one after the other, just like that. And now, in order to change that, we have to go to this position section here. And here we can see there are a couple of options that we can set. And the most important here is this position property that basically just has 2 values. And we will now try to figure out what those values actually mean. So the default option for your elements is a relative position property. And relative just means that it is basically taking part in the kind of Flexbox system. So it is considering the other elements for where its place is, and is kind of nicely adhering to the rules that Flexbox dictates. Now, this does, however, not mean that you can not also add your own stuff or kind of override what Flexbox is telling you. And when you have your positions, your positioning set to relative, but you start touching those left, top, right, and bottom values, let's see what happens. Let's now take this this top element here, and let's say that we set the top value here to 50 pixels. And now what you can see, this element is kind of jumping down. Now, to see this a little bit better, let's also give it a left value of 100 pixels, or even 150 pixels. Now it's kind of floating around. And what happened here is that the system is kind of calculating where would the actual position of the element be according to its Flexbox rules. And that position would be just at the top at the top here. Now those positions are always kind of rooted at the left top corner. So this would be this corner. So this was this position. And from this position, I am going 150 left and 150 down. Now top means 50 down from the top. And that is sort of my new position. Now what happens if we do the same thing to this last element here? We give it a top value of 50 and a left value of 150. And you can see what you might have expected is that when we say top 50, that it would also jump over here. But that's not what it does as long as it's set to relative positioning, because what it's doing is, again, it's calculating its original position in the Flexbox system, and this was somewhere here, and it's moving, kind of offsetting the element based on this position. So this element is still taking part of in the Flexbox system, but it's kind of being offset by those values. And you can see we could create all sorts of crazy kind of Kandinsky patterns. If you know the German painter, he always painted like those forms on some colors basically, and get some layout that has nothing to do with this kind of traditional boxes in boxes, rows in boxes, everything is ordered and aligned system. But you are still being relative to those actual values. So you can still basically retrieve where the original place of this element would have been. So let's now reset those. When we reset those, they should go back to their original positions. We could also do that obviously by going to unset. And now they are sort of untouched and in their initial state again. And now let's see what we can do with the other thing, which is the absolute positioning. And now you see when I change this element to absolute positioning, it immediately jumps to the top left here. And now the element is kind of genuinely detached from the Flexbox system. It is not interested in the Flexbox system at all. And you can also see what happens as a consequence is that those other elements stop taking into account the existence of this element, right? So when I just remove this back again, I will just unset all those properties. You can see that the elements again kind of take the element into consideration. Maybe it would be a little bit helpful if we changed the color of this one element. And now let's do the same thing again. Let's set it to absolute positioning. And now we can see the element, because they are of the same size, it's actually covering the other element. It's hiding the other element. But those other elements, let's see if I can drag this away. Those other elements are not considering this element in their rules anymore. And so they were saying, okay, there is no middle element. So basically this was initially the last element said, okay, I'm now allowed to jump into this position that this element had before. And you can see in UI Builder, you can now actually even drag your object around, and it will sort of calculate the left and top offsets for you, which is actually quite nice. But those values now mean something else. Those are not values that reference the original position in the Flexbox system, but they are now real absolute values. That means I purposely set this whole thing up to be 500 by 500 pixels. So now when I choose this element and I move this to the bottom corner here, you can see we almost get 400 by 400 because the element itself has 100 pixels. That means this point is at 400 by 400. When we go over here, you can see we are almost at 0 for left, and here we are almost at 400 for left again. That means that those values now are basically only referring to the whole container and not to the actual position in Flexbox anymore. And this can be used in all sorts of ways. As I just pointed out before, you have to use this, for example, when you want to realize something like a drag and drop system, because then your element kind of has to go over other elements to be dragged. And also if you have any kind of overlays, and we will just see one of those examples. For this, I need to change the project actually. Let me just save that. Now I will change the project. Now this is just supposed to be any kind of basic, boring, I don't know, website layout or something like that. All of those elements are just visual elements with some colors, and they are just in some kind of Flexbox, your normal Flexbox grid, like we basically did a couple of times. There is nothing fancy here, and none of those elements has its positioning changed or touched. And so now let's say that our goal is that we have this website or we have this game screen, and we want to add an overlay window that is basically, I don't know, asking the player, do you really want to stop the game or something like that? Or do you really want to save? Or do you really want to, I don't know, destroy your character? Something like that. That would typically be solved as kind of this modal window that will appear over all the rest. And you can easily do that with absolute positioning. I just have to add a new visual element. Now, when I just add this, by default, it's kind of inside, it's taking part in the Flexbox game. That means it's just attached to the bottom here, and it kind of moves the other elements above. But now you can see when I change this to absolute, now it leaves the Flexbox system. The other elements ignore it. And now let's say that we add some element that will be our actual pop-up. And what we now want to do, we want to take this absolute element and let it, let's just quickly say we want the size to be 100% by 100%, so it's covering the whole screen. Now we want to give this some transparent thing so that we can see that it's actually active. And now we are having this inner element, and now the funny thing is this inner element is again playing the Flexbox game, because it's not interested what its parent container is kind of doing. So we can easily say we want this element to be, let's say, 60% by 60%, and we want it to be centered, so we can now use the Flexbox alignment again, center and center. Now you can see it's centered, and now we give it some color. Yeah, okay, whatever. It doesn't really matter. And now we could give it some text label and write something like, I don't know, do you really want to quit? And obviously, in order to see something, let's do it like that. Let's make it much bigger, like that. And I don't know, yeah, center, something like this. And you can see, just like that, we created this modal overlay by utilizing this absolute positioning of kind of the root of this element. And now you would have something in your scripts that would kind of turn the visibility on and off. However, the nice thing for kind of the rest of your screen is that as soon as we set this element to absolute, it does not interfere with the Flexbox system of the underlying window. So this window absolutely doesn't care what is happening to the window above, to our model window, and then we could add buttons and functionality and stuff like that. So I think this was the last important piece that we needed for our positioning, and you will see we will use this a couple of times in the scripts later as well, because we will do something like dragging, and we will do something like those overlay windows for some more real use cases later. However, we need to find a point at which we have to stop going over all the properties. Now, there are a couple of things that we didn't talk a lot about. We didn't really talk a lot about the size property, although we touched it a couple of times about those min and max things. We didn't talk about this wrap property here in the flex section, but again, we cannot touch every single thing that you might have to deal with in UI Toolkit, and I'm sure you will figure a lot of those things out on your own. And also some of those things we will use in the upcoming lectures, so they will be sort of covered one way or the other. But we have to make a stop somewhere. I hope you enjoyed this somehow, had a kind of fun, found some of those things useful, and we are now moving on and actually start writing some scripts and some behavior.